This is an amazing room, right? We have people who've come from all over the country and all over the world. I think my friend Tao Jingzhao may win the door prize for the farthest trip from Beijing, although we have folks from Brazil, we have folks from Latin America who have come to be with us, all over the United States, Europe, etc. And that is a reflection of why this center was started. It was started because 40 years ago, you couldn't or wouldn't have assembled a room like this. Lawyers, the legal profession was hardly national, let alone global. And law schools did not study the legal profession. Law schools study law, and occasionally Supreme Court justices. Now, some of our students do become Supreme Court justices. Dana had a lot to do with actually our most recent wonderful Supreme Court justice. Let's give her a hand for that. But most of us are not going to be Supreme Court justices. Most of the people who go to law school become lawyers in one way or another. That is, they either practice law, the vast majority of them, at least for some period of time. And even if, like my friend Ken Frazier and many of you in this room, they go off to do other kinds of things, the fact of the matter is that they remain lawyers in some fundamental way. And understanding what that means and the pathways people take is something really that had not been done before. The origins of this, as some of you have said, gee, you were the director 40 years ago? I said, no, not 40 years ago, only 30. But since I just had my 50th high school reunion, it's not really a crazy question. But 40 years ago, this center was started by the then dean of Harvard Law School, which some of you may know, Jim Vorenberg. He was an incredible person who had a very broad kind of view of what law schools should be about. And he became dean in 1981 at a time in which the legal profession was changing dramatically. In 1960, there were about 250,000 lawyers in the United States. By 1980, there were close to 500,000. In 1960, 98% of those lawyers were men and 99% of them were white. By 1980, it was now entering law students were closer to 40% women and a significant, though still not enough, people of color. It was increasingly becoming an institutionalized profession. So in 1965, Sherman & Sterling, a firm that's been in the news just a tad, had 165 lawyers. And it was the largest law firm, not just in the United States, but in the world. By 1980, there were dozens of law firms that were that big, and now, of course, there are many that are more than 10 times or 20 times that big, including what A&O Sherman is about to become. And it wasn't just law firms. The whole in-house legal profession was really born in the 1980s. There had been in-house lawyers before, but nothing like what the profession that so many of you are a part of today. Or government lawyers. There, of course, were prosecutors and defense lawyers, and there were lawyers in government agencies, but the size of the government lawyering just exploded in the 1980s and beyond, including the creation of many new roles like general counsels in the government, which didn't exist before, let alone in public interest organizations, let alone lawyers who were entrepreneurs and CEOs. The professions were changing dramatically. And so, to his credit, Jim Vorenberg said, we ought to study this. And he invited another legendary Harvard Law School professor, some of you may know, Phil Heinemann. Both Jim and Phil had served together with Archie Cox in the Watergate prosecutor's office. They both had a broad view of what lawyering could be. In fact, Jim had been a partner in a law firm. He'd been a lawyer in government. He had been a public interest lawyer before becoming dean. He'd studied the legal profession. And they thought that that's what we ought to be doing. And they established the center really on kind of two principles. Phil Hyman said this, using Harvard's incredible convening power to bring together not just academics, but practitioners, thought leaders, people from all different disciplines to think about the cutting edge issues facing the legal profession. And then second, to generate world-class research that would be published not just in obscure academic journals that nobody reads, like the ones I write in, but that would be made available in a way that could be easily engaged with and digested by the people who were being affected, which are busy practitioners and those we serve. In the 40 years since this was founded, we've tried to uphold those principles. We have big shoes to fill. They started actually in 1985 with what was then called the Program on the Legal Profession, had the first conference ever, academic conference on, quote, the new corporate law firm, in which they had a bunch of legendary law professors and academics from other disciplines talking about things like the rise of the corporate law firm, in-house legal departments, ethics of lawyers, the structure and compensation of lawyers, and had practitioners and academics from other disciplines comment on these issues, and then published it all in an issue of the Stanford Law Review that is actually, quite frankly, still read by many people and cited today. They then went further and created a series of case studies, not the kinds of cases we think about in law school, you know, in dusty old law books written by justices from long ago, but instead case studies of real organizations and real lawyers struggling with real questions, trying to help people understand what were the challenges involved in being a lawyer in the 1980s and 1990s, and they published it as a book of case studies called The Social Responsibility of Lawyers, which again is still cited today. It's that tradition that I've tried to uphold as the director of the center here. I took over. Phil Heinemann, after starting the center, stepped aside in 1985. He was followed by a wonderful man named Gary Singson, who had been connected with the legal services community and therefore added a much greater focus on access to justice. And then I became the director in 1992. We would have had this dinner in 1992, but 2022, but COVID intervened. But we've tried to kind of build on that legacy in sort of three ways. One, we try to conduct world-class systematic research on the cutting-edge issues facing the legal profession today. That research is empirical in character, it's global, it's interdisciplinary, and it tries to look at some of the most important issues that all of you are thinking about. How do lawyers build careers, particularly in a more diverse profession, as Goodwin Liu said. We did the first ever study of Harvard Law School career graduates ever done. It turned out Harvard, like most law schools, could tell you a lot about what you were going to do the year after you graduated. And then after that, you know, if you had enough money to name a building after you, they knew what you did. And if you did something that my friend, the U.S. attorney, would be interested in, they cut you out of the yearbook. And other than that, we knew nothing, all right? We followed systematically the careers, not just of lawyers at Harvard, but across the entire legal profession in a giant 10-year longitudinal study called After the JD Project. We're looking at innovation in legal services. What does it mean to have a profession be disrupted by technology, by project management, by process management? What does it mean to think about lawyers who don't just deliver legal advice, but actually do something radical? Help clients create real solutions to real problems. As Brad Smith, also on our advisory board, who couldn't be here today, said, lawyers are a lot better at solving problems than they are at identifying or preventing them. How do we, as Ken Frazier said, become people who help our clients avoid problems and help society move to a better place? What does it mean to be a professional in the 21st century? My colleague Ben Heineman and I, as well as the former general counsel of GE, we have almost every general counsel ever from GE in this very room today. We call it the Heineman tree. Ben and Bill Lee, the former managing partner of Wilmer and Hale and I, wrote a piece called Lawyers as Professionals and as Citizens, Rights and Responsibilities for the 21st Century, to try to think about what does the meaning of professionalism in this world mean? And how do we think about it in a global context? I've been for now almost 15 years, and many of you are connected with this project, running something we call Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it. I don't sing and I don't wear a tracksuit. Some of you will get that joke. But I do study how is globalization reshaping the market for legal services in important places like India, China, Brazil, ASEAN, and now increasingly in Africa and the rest of Latin America. Critical for our students to understand. The second leg of the stool is around teaching. How do we teach the next generation of lawyers and the current generation of lawyers in ways that will allow them to thrive and prosper, not just for themselves, but also for those they serve and the societies in which they live. In 2007, along with a colleague named Ashish Nanda, I started something called the Harvard Law School Executive Education Programs, because I realized that most of the lawyers running leading institutions were going to Harvard Business School to try to figure out how to manage them, because nobody ever taught them how to manage and lead an organization of size and scope. Over the years, we've trained thousands, tens of thousands of leading lawyers and law firms and legal departments and public service organizations and government in all sorts of walks of life. And I am very proud that that program is now run by my former student, Scott Westfall, who is in the room right here. And we teach that program through the kinds of case studies that Phil Heineman and Lance Liebman, who co-authored that book, did all those years ago. We also have an academic fellowship program in which we're trying to train the next generation of academics, not just in law schools, but in other departments, sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, not just in the United States, but around the world. We have several of our academic fellows. You heard from Shweta Balakrishnan earlier, but there are many others here. Young-Kyu Kim, who's here from Korea, in which to try to seed a kind of interdisciplinary thought about how do we think about these problems, because the legal profession does not belong to lawyers alone, let alone the law. We also have a student fellowship program, of which Jeannie Antono, who you heard from in the video, is our star example. Jeannie, in her project she didn't mention, ran a whole podcast in which she interviewed leading Asian American general counsels, 10 of them. You can find it. It's still on the, she will send around the link. It is incredibly well done, and it opened a world not just for law students, but for people like Jeannie who are in college or other people who might be interested not only in the career of being a general counsel, but understanding how our law works and how some of the most important people who are important in our law work. None of this would work without the third leg of the stool, and that's what we call bridging. And that's simply events like this. It's trying to bridge the biggest gap in the world, and that's the gap between theory and practice, between academics and lawyers and practitioners and others. It's not quite true that those worlds have been going in opposite directions, but they've been moving away from each other, and that is to the detriment of both. Sometimes this is a debate between should we have more theory or should we have more practice? Well, the answer is both, because what we really need is a theory of practice, right? What do we mean by what practice means in this kind of environment? And we need theory grounded in practice, grounded in the realities of the world of lawyers and the world of those they serve. We have done literally hundreds of events like this. Cheryl Lynn mentioned one of the most prominent that we just did called Reimagining the Role of Business in the Public Square. We had 600 people come to Harvard, again, just with an open invitation in September 2022. Heads of public interest organizations like Cheryl Lynn, former governors and mayors. We had heads of industry. We had leading environmental scholars. We tried to grapple with what are the real issues facing this world if we're going to live in it. And maybe my most proud thing was I got the law school, business school, Kennedy School of Government and Arts and Sciences actually to speak to each other and to collaborate on a single event. That is quite an accomplishment. And we ensured that the voices of young people, like real young people, were there. And for example, our last session, we had the president of Harvard, the outgoing president, Larry Bacow, was about to give his final address. And he was on a program with the head of Divest Harvard, because we felt that if we're going to talk about these issues, we have to have all of the relevant voices in the room. We've done many, many other conferences like that. And as Jeannie said, you can follow that and our other work in something I'm really proud of, which is our digital magazine, The Practice, which is more than 15 years old. Again, I thought there was nothing in law between the Harvard Law Review, which no one reads, including me, and I publish in it, and the American Lawyer, which, no offense to any journalist, no one should believe. And there's actually nothing in the middle, right? But in business, you have the Harvard Business Review, you have The Economist, you have serious publications that try to take academic research and make it accessible and engaged for busy practitioners. We've been publishing it 6 times a year. Brian Fong, who you see roaming around, is about to give me the hook because it's about time for me to stop talking, is the real editor of The Practice. I'm the fake editor of The Practice. Dana Walters, who's around here someplace, is our lead writer. And each issue takes on a serious issue. We just did one on ChatGPT. We just did one on law firm strategy, which Bob Couture, sitting in the audience here, former COO of McGuire Woods, helped us to think about. We did one on our ESG conference, in which we profiled 7 closed-door sessions that we did around cutting-edge ESG issues, Chatham House rules, like when do you make public statements, ESG metrics, workforce equity issues like 110 that Ken Fraser's involved in, issues that we don't talk enough about, metrics. How do you measure the success of a diversity issue? So it's free to subscribe. I hope you will all subscribe it, and that will hopefully fulfill my last promise, which is to give you something concrete that you can take away from the work that we've been doing. Because as I say, the work is just begun. I mean, think of all the radical changes that have happened in our profession over just the last 2 years. If I had said to most law firm, even progressive people like Brad Karp, oh, we could have remote work and people could, he would say, are you kidding? No, everybody has to be in the office 24. Okay, then we were all kicked online and now we have to figure out what this means. What's the future of hybrid work? How do we work with ChatGPT, right? Because we are certainly, that's the foreseeable future, is that we will be working with technology, but are we trained to work with technology? We went to law school because we couldn't do math and didn't like the sight of blood. Law school, you know? So how are we going to how do we think about creating norms in a global context? How do we think about creating a truly inclusive and equitable society? These are big, big problems, and we're not going to solve them without having all of you with us.